The first time he saw her, the sky was the color of unspun wool, soft, low, threaded with rain that never quite committed. Elias stood beneath the awning of the harbour bookshop, a paper cup warming his hands, while the wind ferried the smell of tide and kelp along the quay. Boats tapped their moorings with a hollow patience, and the gulls sounded like creaking hinges. He had come to the coast to feel small on purpose, to let the largeness of weather and water size him correctly, as if a right measurement might quiet the noise inside his head. He didn't expect to recognize a stranger. She stepped out of the shop with a parcel wrapped in brown paper and twine, chin tucked in a scarf, the blue-green of shallow water over sand. For a moment, brief as a flicker, the world aligned around the tilt of her face. Elias had the unreasonable sense he had waited at some border for this exact crossing, though he didn't know its name until now. The feeling wasn't lightning. It was a soft click, like a door he had tried for years easing open because he pressed it the right way, not harder. She noticed the rain first, then the puddle, then him, her gaze moving with practical care. When their eyes met, hers widened in a shy startle, not fear, but recognition's cousin. He felt a small brightness uncurl in his chest, warm as tea. People talk about love at first sight as if it's a single bright strike. This was different. It was the quiet, someone else breathing in the same key. "Do you mind if I share your awning?" she asked, and even her voice felt familiar in the way certain songs feel like you've always known the chorus. He stepped back, making space. "Of course." Rain drifted diagonally, a thoughtful rain, landing soft on the cobbles. It carried the cold neatly, without spite. The shop window behind them reflected their shoulders, the pale harbour, the uneven string of lights swaying above the quay. She untucked one hand to adjust the twine around her parcel. Her fingers were small and competent, the nails trimmed blunt, a thin silver ring on her index finger worn smooth by time. "You picked a good day for books," he said, because silence suddenly felt like a reckless choice. "Nothing else keeps its promises like paper when it rains." Her mouth curved, not broadly, but with precision, as if she allowed herself one careful inch of joy. "I like the sound of pages turning when the weather is like this. It's like a separate kind of rain." She said it lightly, not as a confession, but he heard the small truth in it and wanted to collect it carefully so it wouldn't bruise. He nodded. "I'm Elias." "Marin." The name fit the day. Sea in it, salt at the edges. She looked past him toward the breakwater, where a beacon pulsed its calm, timed heartbeat. "I used to come to towns like this when I needed to feel I could still be new somewhere. Did it work?" The question left his mouth before he could edit it into something less exposing. Her eyes moved back to him, steady, measuring. "Sometimes. Then I'd go home and unpack the same old boxes, and everything I folded away would raise its head and be itself again." She smiled as if to soften the admission. "I suppose novelty isn't the same as beginning." The rain deepened, a little more certain. He could hear the purl of it along the gutters, the small applause where it found metal. He thought of his own boxes, literal and otherwise. The portfolio zipped shut beneath his bed in the rented room, the unsent letter on his desk, the copy of a formal apology he had rewritten and rewritten until the apology itself felt thinner than the paper. He had come to the coast to stop rehearsing the same scene. He didn't say any of this. He said gently, "What did you buy?" She lifted the parcel. Something I left behind once and decided I shouldn't have. When he raised an eyebrow, she added, "A novel I borrowed from a friend 10 years ago and never finished. The ending kept imagining itself whenever I was tired. It was wrong every time, and yet I kept it. Lately that started to feel like a superstition, or theft, depending on the day." "What's it called?" She hesitated, as if the title was private, a small scar beneath a sleeve. "The Cartographer's Wife." He didn't know the book, but he knew the feeling. The wish to return and finish something, so the unfinished part didn't finish you instead. "Do you live here?" he asked, then wondered if it sounded too direct. "I'm staying up by the lighthouse for a bit," she said. "A friend is letting me borrow his cottage while he's teaching abroad. It creaks like an old boat at night, which I suppose is a kind of lullaby if you want it to be. I'm just above the harbour." "Not as romantic." He gestured vaguely toward the hill. "It does have a stubborn lemon tree that refuses to understand it's not Italy." "That sounds exactly like the kind of optimism I need to be near." She said it too quickly and flushed, as if she'd surprised herself. The flush rose and faded in a soft sequence, like a tide the body keeps when it thinks no one is looking. They stood with the ease of people waiting for a bus that might never come, but enjoying the waiting as if it were its own destination. A fisherman passed, pulling a handcart, nodding to them without breaking stride. A dog, rain-damp and scruffy, shook with such sincerity it flung a halo of droplets onto Marin's boots. She laughed, not a performance but a clear small bell, and leaned down to scratch its ears. Elias watched the gentleness of her hand, the way animals trust the people who have learned to move more slowly than their fear. He felt the simple, aching wish to learn the same pace. "Do you like maps?" she asked suddenly, as if the thought had climbed a ladder straight to her mouth. "The way paper can hold a place without needing to own it?" "I draw them sometimes," he said, then corrected himself, humbled by the honesty of the rain. "I used to, not maps exactly, buildings, places I imagined might forgive a person just for choosing to live inside them." She considered that. "I think I know a house like that." She pointed with her chin toward the lighthouse road. "It has 3 windows on the west side. In the afternoons, the light goes through the glass and lands on the floor like a warm square you can step into if your feet are cold. It forgives most things if you stand in that square long enough." He pictured it without effort. The room, the square, a person standing there until the body remembered warmth as something reliable. "Would you let a stranger try it?" he asked, and then immediately, "That sounded like a line." "I'm sorry." "It sounded like you were tired," she said, not unkindly, "which is a better reason to ask for a warm square. I could make tea. I'm told it's dangerous to refuse the rain a narrative." The invitation arrived with no flourish, laid down gently between them like a map unfolded on a low table. He felt the little click again. Not a sharp craving, a permission. "I don't want to intrude." "You wouldn't. Also," she added, looking briefly amused with herself, "you're a witness. The cottage keeps strange noises when the weather turns. If there's a ghost, I'd like to be believed about it. Or I suppose we could become believers together, which is one way to be less alone." The thought made him smile. 2 cautious people agreeing to be less alone in increments, with tea, with the possibility of ghosts, with a square of light applied as medicine. "I accept," he said. On behalf of the rain's narrative. The walk up the hill stitched their silences and sentences into something that felt like attention, not performance. The road curved past weathered fences and hydrangeas holding rain like cupped hands. Maran kept a pace that waited for him in invisible ways, slowing at puddles without making a show of it, matching his stride when the wind leaned hard from the sea. She asked about nothing large, only the important smallnesses, if he preferred milk in tea, if he minded lighthouse horns, if he could sleep with the windows open. He found himself answering in fuller sentences than he'd used in months. The tide licked the rocks in a steady metronome. The lighthouse blinked its patient yes. The cottage crouched on the slope like a weathered cat, shingles dark with rain, a driftwood crossbar for a clothesline, a red kettle visible through the kitchen window as if the house kept its own heart on the stove. Inside, it smelled faintly of salt and lemon oil, the floors soft with old wood that had been walked kindly. Marin set the parcel on a table and unwound her scarf, and the room reorganized itself around her. He had a thought that certain people were their own hearths. "Tea," she said, already moving to the kettle with the quiet competence that comes from years of making small survivals feel like rituals. "There's honey, if you're a believer." "I am," he said, "in honey, and in small survivals." While the water hummed, she lit a lamp, though it was mid-afternoon. The warm circle of its light cupped the table, the book parcel, their empty cups, and the careful space between them. Elias studied the little objects that make a life visible: a bowl of smooth stones, each the size of a thumb, a tin of biscuits with a dented lid, a scrap of paper pinned to the wall with a list written in tiny, organized script: salt, thread, stamps, courage, underlined twice. He looked away, not wanting to let his curiosity become a trespass. She caught the glance and followed it, smiling with a faint embarrassment. "I write things I forget to carry," she said. "Sometimes the forgetting is the heaviest thing in the room." He thought of the apology on his desk, the one he had rehearsed for so long it had lost its original shape. He felt, suddenly, the fatigue of being a person who had tried to carry something alone for too many miles. "You can set things down here," Marin said, as if hearing an exterior version of what had not yet reached his mouth. "Not forever. Just long enough to check if they're worth lifting again." He took the cup she offered, felt the heat of it extend his hands back to him from the cold. "What did you mean earlier," he asked carefully, "about leaving something behind and deciding you shouldn't have?" She leaned her hip against the counter, considering the question with the willingness of someone who has practiced being honest and also practiced stopping when honesty threatens to become spectacle. "I once gave up a future because it looked too much like my past," she said. "It felt like the careful choice. But careful can be fear in tidy clothing." He understood more than one layer of that, and because he understood, he lowered his gaze to the tea, as if the surface might tell him how not to ruin an afternoon with too much truth. "I gave up a present," he said finally. "I kept rehearsing yesterday until today could only clap politely and leave." Marin did not rush to fill the quiet that followed. The kettle ticked as it cooled. The lighthouse sighed. Rain touched the window with 2 fingers, as if reminding the house to keep breathing. When she spoke again, her voice had that particular softness people reserve for new birds in their palms. "Then maybe this is the right weather," she said, "for learning a different habit of time." They drank tea and watched the room warm around them. Elias felt something unclench along the length of his spine. Marin unwrapped the book, peeled away the paper carefully, and folded it for later use, like a person who honors second chances even in simple things. The cover was sea green, the typography old-fashioned, the corners softened by years. She set it between them on the table, not offering, not withholding, as if the book could decide by its own gravity where it wished to belong. Beyond the glass, the rain thinned to a hush, and the light that found its way westward through the 3 windows made a square on the floor exactly as she'd promised. Marin noticed it at the same moment he did, and they both looked down, then up, caught out by the synchronicity, smiling like conspirators. He moved first, stepped into it. The warmth lifted through the soles of his feet and climbed his bones like a gentle, climbing ivy. He looked at her without performing it, simply existing in the light, and said what felt most true in that moment, without decoration or strategy. "This feels like a beginning." The square of light moved while they talked, slipping off his shoes and up the legs of the table, then withdrawing like a tide, leaving soft patterns of itself. Elias listened to Marin describe the noises the cottage made at night, not catalogued as fear, but as company. The kettle's single pop while cooling, the old stove's sigh, the roof's small whispers when the wind pressed its ear to the shingles. He realized with a quiet embarrassment that he had been collecting sounds of his own, an inventory of loneliness disguised as observation. In his rented room, he could name the refrigerator's cough, the neighbor's late laugh through the thin wall, the way the lemon tree's leaves scraped the window when the breeze misjudged itself. Here, he felt the list relax its grip, as if a hand unclasped around it. Marin opened the back door to air the room, and the rain's scent came in softer, carrying the iron sweetness left on rocks after a storm. The sea was a graphite plain beyond the scrim of yard, rope coiled on a hook, a low bench with a crooked spine, a drift of shells arranged in an unconscious constellation on the windowsill. She reached for a tin near the stove and shook out 2 biscuits with the concentration of someone distributing rations in a tale about survival. He laughed a little at his own thought. He was so ready to understand everything as proof of some larger endurance that even biscuits became a metaphor. "Walk," she said after a time, as if testing the word for weight. "Now?" "The rain is considering its exit. It tends to be generous before it leaves." They stepped into the open. The path from the cottage to the lighthouse was a ribbon of packed earth threaded with small stones. On the left, the hillside sloped into a tangle of broom and sea thrift, the colours nervy and alive in the wet. On the right, the land paused, and the sea began without ceremony. Marin set the pace again, unhurried, attentive to where the ground turned slick. Elias felt a muscle he hadn't noticed relax behind his sternum. He had been bracing himself for months against something fixed and nameless. It turned out to be his own anticipation. The act of walking beside someone, matching breath to breath, unstitched the bracing. They did not exchange biographies, the way some new acquaintances toss their names into the air, along with a handful of facts, to see what sticks. Instead, the conversation curled around incidentals and then opened unexpectedly into truth, like a shell that looks solid until you find the hinge. Marin spoke of the tide clock above the cottage sink, how it ticked not in seconds but in patience. He said he used to keep a metronome on his desk and set it to a heartbeat when he couldn't find one he could trust. She admitted she sometimes fell asleep to recordings of trains, a practiced self-consolation, a borrowed narrative of going somewhere. He told her that for months he had been designing buildings he never drafted, rooms he never dared to enter, even on paper. "Do you still draw?" she asked. "In my mind, endlessly. On paper, almost not at all." He waited, then added, "There was a mistake that learned my name and called for me until I answered." The wind lifted, cool and clean. Marin did not ask for the mistake's shape. She pressed her hand briefly to his sleeve, a steadying touch with no attached demand, then removed it. The gentleness of that unattachment, comfort without custody, moved him more than a longer embrace might have. At the lighthouse, the world made its own precise geometry. The tower rose plain and white against a sky smudged with receding weather. The metal railing circled the gallery like a measure in a song. The sea beat its ancient drum along the rocks. Elias watched the lamp's slow turn, felt the quiet authority of repetition done in service of others, a light committed to the long work of being seen. He wondered, not unkindly, who had taught him the myth that he had to be exceptional to be forgiven, when in truth most forgiveness is workmanlike and daily, like sweeping sand off the threshold so the door closes. They stood with their backs to the wind. Marin closed her eyes, as if to let her other senses weigh the air. He saw then the shadow of tiredness along her mouth, the kind that doesn't vanish after one good night's sleep. The impulse to ask its story rose in him, a welling, almost a tide, and he placed a hand on the cool rail instead, trusting that some threads are woven only when the loom says so. "Once, years ago," she said without prompting, eyes still closed, "I loved someone who made plans in sentences that sounded like promises. He wasn't lying. He believed his own voice, but his belief kept moving the finish line. I learned a strange kind of endurance, running toward quiet prizes that never stopped receding. When I finally stopped, I didn't know how to trust stillness. I mistook it for absence." He thought of the metronome again, the tick-tock he had set to a borrowed heart. "I mistook noise for proof," he said. "Noise meant the machine was on. If the machine was on, work was happening. And if work was happening, then surely I was becoming the person those apologies required." He exhaled, chilly air ribbing his lungs. "Instead, I got very good at arranging furniture in a room I never entered." Marin opened her eyes, as if satisfied with the wind's report. "You're here," she said simply, as if announcing a road sign. "Sometimes that's the whole puzzle." They circled back down the path when the rain finally withdrew and left the day rinsed. They walked in companionable quiet for a stretch, and then shared memories in short, complete shapes, not as confessions, not as exhibits, just objects placed gently on the table between them with the assurance that each would be handled with care. Elias told her about the letter on his desk and the way the words wore thin like river stones. She said there are letters best read aloud to a wall and letters best buried in a garden where their language can decompose into something that feeds what grows next. He laughed, startled by the relief of that image, the simple generosity of it. At the cottage he helped bring in the wash from the line, a brave handful of towels that had dared the weather. The kitchen warmed with the effort of two people moving around each other without bumping, a choreography that felt surprisingly earned. Marin set a pot of soup on the stove, a practical magic that filled the room with patient fragrance. Elias sliced bread, pleased by the plain competence of the task, the way a serrated knife asks you to go slowly and rewards you when you listen. They ate at the small table. Steam lifted from the bowls in soft threads. Between spoonfuls, he noticed details that made the place feel hospitable to imperfections. Scratches on the tabletop like old cartography, a mismatched chair with one leg shyly shorter than the others, a hairline crack in a mug repaired with a thin vein of gold, kintsugi, a name he loved for the way it suggested that breaking is not the end of a story, but a turn. The mug suited Maren's hands. It seemed likely that she had mended it herself. "Where would you put a window," she asked, "if you could cut one anywhere in this room?" He let the question settle, then stood to look. The west windows were already their own blessing. The north wall faced the hill, moss-stippled and secretive. The east offered the yard's small grammar of rope and bench and shell. He turned slowly, thinking not of seeing more, but of seeing truer. "Here," he said finally, touching the south wall with his palm. Low, a long slice, near the floor. "So when you sit on the rug with your back against the cabinet, you can watch the line where sky meets water without craning, a horizon you can hold at knee level." Maren looked at the blank wall as if the window were already installed. "I like how you think," she said. She did not mean it as flattery. He felt no dusting of praise. Instead, it sounded like a practical agreement, the beginning of a shared vocabulary. After lunch, the weather parted into a shy sun, and they carried their cups onto the small back step. A cat appeared, as if conjured by the sound of soup spoons, and sat at the exact edge of confidence near Maren's ankle. It was a patchwork animal, stitched from twilight and cream, with a tail that told long stories. Maren bent and offered her hand. The cat allowed its head to be petted with a graciousness that bordered on irony, then hopped onto Elias's lap without ceremony, kneading gently as if cataloguing a new kind of softness. He felt the quiet, rhythmic weight of it like a pendulum reteaching him time. "Her name is Peony," Maren said. "She arrived last spring and decided not to leave." "Does she belong to anyone?" "She belongs to the afternoon." A small smile. "And to whoever remembers to open the back door." Peony's purr was a low engine. Elias thought of the life he had left an hour's drive away, a life technically paused, though it had not asked his permission to continue without him. He felt both the ache of that pause and the relief. It was not a door slammed, it was a door braced open with a book so the draft could pass through the house and rearrange the temperature. Perhaps that was why the sight of the sea held him. Its movement didn't require decisions. It simply kept being itself with a steady, soothing insistence. He realized that in Maren's presence his thoughts formed in longer lines, less interrupted by the anxious punctuation that had broken them into fragments lately. He considered telling her this and decided to save it, not out of caution, but to savor the joy of having something good to give later. As afternoon deepened, shadows laid their quiet geometry over the floor. Maren took out a small box of photographs and spread them face down on the table, turning them over one by one, not pausing at any for longer than another. The images were humble. Hands holding berries, a boot print in fresh snow, a window reflection catching a gull's wing in crooked flight. She said they were the size she liked for memory, large enough to keep, small enough to carry without feeling like weight. He asked if he could take one. She slid a picture across to him, the square of light on the cottage floor from some other day, empty of feet, waiting. When the kettle chimed again, they made more tea. Outside, the sky shifted toward evening with the unhurried grace of a promise being kept. Elias stood and stretched, a small ache unfolding in his back. He glanced at the coat rack, at Marin's scarf hung to dry, the blue-green deepened by wet. He imagined a future version of this room with drawings pinned to the wall near the list: salt, thread, stamps, courage, sketches of windows low and long, of rooms that let the body rest without asking it to prove anything first. Peony left his lap and leapt to the floor with a soft thud that sounded like agreement. Marin lit the lamp again. The same warm circle poured onto the table like a gentle golden pool. He met her eyes across it, safe within the pool's border. The day had asked nothing flamboyant of him, and yet he felt fuller than he had in months, as if a kindness had been applied to his edges and smoothed them. He stayed until the lighthouse blinked its first evening syllable. Then he stood, reluctant without panic, tender to the fact that leaving now made space for returning. Marin walked him to the door. The air had cooled, saltier after rain, the grass along the path still beaded with small, perfect hemispheres of water. "Thank you," he said, meaning more than tea and soup and shelter, meaning the square of light and the low imagined window, the permission to speak without finishing the story, meaning her. She nodded, a precise kindness. "Come back tomorrow," she said, as if suggesting something that had already decided itself. Sometimes the kettle is its best self on second days. Night pressed itself against the harbour with the patience of velvet, and Elias walked down the hill as if each step carried a secret weight he was almost willing to acknowledge. The sea kept its rhythm beneath the sky, lanterns swayed in slow arcs outside the fishermen's sheds, and the cobblestones glistened with leftover rain. His rented room waited with its familiar silence, but when he crossed the threshold, it no longer felt like exile. It felt like a pause between chapters. He set the photograph Marin had given him on the table by the window. The square of light in the picture seemed to hum faintly, as if remembering itself into his room. He left the lamp unlit, allowing the photograph's glow, imagined but insistent, to hold the space. Sleep arrived with more gentleness than usual. He dreamed not of apologies rehearsed, or hallways that ended before they began, but of windows cut low into walls, horizons waiting at the level of his knees, and a kettle's steady hum. He woke with the tide's voice still in his ears. The morning spread pale and forgiving across the floor. For the first time in many months, he felt less like he had to rush into the day and more like the day might wait with him, a companion rather than a demand. He dressed without hurry, carrying the photograph in his pocket as if it were a compass, and found his feet turning instinctively back toward the lighthouse road. When Marin opened the cottage door, the air was filled with the fragrance of toast and the faint rustle of pages being turned. She greeted him not as a surprise guest, but as if the weather itself had returned, expected and welcome. The cat threaded its tail around his ankle and accepted his presence with the mild sovereignty only cats can manage. They ate breakfast in the hush of wood and light, their words small but sincere, like stones skipped gently across water. Afterward, she pulled from the shelf the book she had retrieved from the shop, the story she had once abandoned, and placed it on the table between them. He saw the care in the way her fingers rested on the cover, not as possession, but as recognition. She opened to the first page and began to read aloud. Her voice carried the sentences with a tender authority, soft and soothing, like the sound of rain against the window, but steadier, more deliberate. He closed his eyes and listened, letting the words seep into the quiet places that had been empty too long. With each paragraph, her voice wrapped around him, not in closing but mending, a stitching together of torn edges he hadn't realized were frayed. When she paused, he opened his eyes to find her watching him, a question resting gently in her gaze. He nodded, unable to summon more language than that. She smiled, the small, healing smile of someone who knows that sometimes the simplest gestures are the strongest. The lighthouse gave its measured sigh beyond the windows, and the square of light began to gather on the floor again, waiting for them both. The square of light stretched longer that afternoon, pouring itself generously across the rug, as though aware it had an audience. Mara set the book aside, marking the page with a ribbon frayed at one edge, and folded her hands in her lap. Elias sat across from her, the warmth of tea still lingering in his palms. A silence settled, but not the kind that bruised. This was the soft, tender quiet that let each breath deepen, the kind that allowed two hearts to find the same rhythm without effort. He noticed how the light braided itself into her hair, how the dust in the air looked like a constellation only they could see. Mara leaned back against the chair, eyes half closed, as though she had given herself permission to rest in the presence of another. He wanted to say something, anything, to honor the moment, but words felt intrusive, brittle against the soft expanse of trust. Instead, he let his gaze rest gently on her, as if his attention alone could be an offering. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, peaceful, almost healing in its cadence. There's a kind of ache that doesn't ask to be solved, only held. She opened her eyes and looked at him, not searching for agreement, but sharing a truth she had carried quietly. He felt something inside him ease, as though those words had found a hollow in his chest and filled it with warmth. Outside, the waves pressed against the rocks in endless vows. The cottage exhaled with the steady comfort of a place long lived in, its wood settling like a body into sleep. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and said softly, "Maybe that's what love is. Not fixing the ache, not erasing it, just staying." Mara's lips curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something gentler, more enduring. She reached across the space and laid her hand over his. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it carried the weight of all the unspoken years between them. His breath caught, not from surprise, but from recognition. This was the door he had pressed against for so long, finally opening with ease. The light pooled around their joined hands, golden and forgiving. Elias thought of every unfinished apology, every rehearsed sentence that had never landed. None of it mattered here, in this small cottage on the hill, where the horizon could be seen at knee level, and the sound of another's voice could heal what silence had broken. Maren looked at him steadily, and in her gaze was both question and answer, both wound and balm. The room seemed to lean closer, the sea's rhythm a steady witness. And as the cat curled against their feet, purring with a soothing persistence, Elias realized that beginnings didn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they came like this, soft, healing, tender, waiting patiently in the quiet until you were brave enough to stay.